What is going on YouTube? Dave here from signalwarrant.com. So something a little different tonight. Not a whole lot of PowerShell, although at the end there is a little script I'll show you, but it's Barney style easy. You can find it anywhere on the interweb. So this is more about process I go through to manage group policy. And I'm making this video because I've gotten a couple questions about how I manage group policy in an enterprise scenario. So this is kind of how I do it, or try to do it. In my mind, number one, keep it as simple as possible. What does that mean? Well, that means you can create a bunch of policies in here with WMI filters, and you can scope them to different users and groups of users and all that stuff. And there may be occasions where you need to do that. But if you can, keep it as simple as you can, as simple as possible, not only for you, but for other administrators you work with, and for people that come in behind you. If you leave an organization, somebody else comes in and has no idea what's going on in your infrastructure. So keep it as simple as possible, and I'll show you kind of how I do this. So here, this is my Active Directory, or my group policy on my domain. And I only have a few policies here because this is just a lab scenario. But the first thing I do is I will segregate computer policy and user policy. Now, some people will say, if you have a large organization and you create a bunch of GPOs, you're adding a bunch of data to your sysvol that's got to replicate, etc., etc. That's absolutely true. So if you're replicating your sysvol, you have domain controllers all over the world, maybe that's not the best scenario for you to do it. I'm just telling you how I do it. So the first thing I'll do, give it a good name. I always start a computer policy with comp, a user policy with user. That way when I come in here, I can quickly understand what policy is affecting a device versus a user. One thing else I do is right-click on the policy, go to GP status, and if it's a computer policy, I'm going to disable the user settings. That way it's not going through the process of trying to pull down any kind of user settings when there's nothing there to process anyway. Second thing I do, I create all my GPOs down here. So my process is I want to set a GPO to turn off the firewall or whatever. First thing I'm going to do is create a policy, a GPO object. So I'm going to go new. This is going to be a computer policy. Windows firewall. So now I know it's computer policy. I'm going to turn off the Windows firewall so I can disable the user part. Go to edit. Now, one other question I get all the time is, how can I search through the management editor to find what setting I'm looking for? Well, the quick answer is you can't really. Well, you can to a certain degree, but you can really only do that on the admin templates of the computer and user policy. So if I right-click that folder, I'm going to turn a filter on, then I'm going to go to filter options, and I just want to search by keyword. Firewall, and that'll give me all the instances of firewall, and then that kind of narrows the scope. So I can, I just happen to know where this one is. So one other thing on group policy, you got to kind of read through the help file here to really understand what you're doing. There's some double negatives in here, and it takes a little bit of reading comprehension and thought to get a good idea of what you're trying to do. So if you disable this policy, Windows Firewall does not run. That's what we want to do. So we're going to disable this. Okay, so that's all I'm going to do for this policy. So I created the group policy object. I haven't linked it anywhere, so it's just sitting here. It has not been applied anywhere. First of all, let me refresh. So there's my the settings that I selected. So firewall stayed off. Whenever I can, I'm going to use the security filtering. I'm going to scope it to authenticated users whenever I can, unless there's a scenario where I have to scope it to a certain subset of users, say in HR or finance or whatever. Again, if you can leave it as generic as possible while also doing what you're trying to do effectively, that's all the better. I'm not going to delegate any of this. This is if you have other administrators, say in a subordinate OU, that you want them to manage a particular policy, you can do that here with delegation. So let's say I want to turn off all the firewalls on my client computer. So my client computers just happen to be in this Steelers 2016 OU. Whenever I can, I'm going to apply the GPO as close to the object as possible. So in this case, it would be on this OU here. So I'm going to right click, link existing GPO, select my firewall, hit go, and now that GPO is enforced, so the next time policy refreshes, that policy will be applied. So that's important to understand. Once you hit OK there, and it's setting underneath your little OU, you have applied that policy the next time group policy refreshes. So it's not real time in the sense of, you're on a switch and you make a switch port change to shut it, and it shuts it down immediately. You got to wait for the refresh. Server 2012, you can right click here, group policy update, and you can force the GPO or the group policy update from the server side, which is much better than requiring it be done on the client side. Okay, so we got our first GPO, we've linked it. One other thing I never do is change the default domain policy or the default domain controller policy. And I don't change those because that is the baseline. It's the default configuration that is shipped with Windows. So if at some point I screw something up or another administrator screws something up, I can always go back and apply that policy and come back to steady state. Okay, another important consideration, and I probably should have said this off the jump first. Before you create any GPOs or link them anywhere, you need to understand the processing order. And the processing order is local policy, then site policy overwrites that, domain policy overwrites the site, organizational unit policy overwrites all that stuff. So what does that mean? That means if at my site level I'm turning off the Windows firewall, and then at my OU level I'm turning it back on, the OU level will overwrite that site policy. So very important to understand, when, particularly if you have a lot of GPOs out there, or if you're coming into a new organization and you're not sure what the heck's going on and who has created what and done what where, you definitely need to understand the processing order. Okay, so you also need to understand block inheritance and enforce. So let's unlink this. Actually, let's just delete it. So you'll notice I deleted that policy from this OU, but it is still here in the group policy objects. So I just deleted the link. I didn't actually delete the policy. So let's say I want to, in my entire domain, I want to turn off Windows Firewall. So I'm going to link that policy at the domain. So now you can come down here to the domain controllers OU. I only have this default policy linked to the OU specifically, but I'm inheriting the firewall, WSS, and all that other stuff. So let's say I want to disable the firewall to all of my clients, or everything on my domain except my domain controllers. So how can I only apply this policy to everything except the domain controller OU? And you can do that by block inheritance. And you see the block inheritance, I think it's an exclamation point. That'll tell you that block inheritance is on. So now you can see only one linked, and the inheritance is turned off, so none of that stuff at the domain level is now being inherited. And this is kind of like scoping to user groups or WMI filters or that kind of thing, and keeping it simple, and try not to use block inheritance as much as possible, if that makes any sense. Don't use block inheritance unless you absolutely have to. How about that? Okay, so that's block inheritance. Inheritance is turned on by default. Right click block inheritance to block the inheritance. Okay, so what is enforce? Enforce basically overrides the block inheritance. So if I go back and I enforce my firewall policy, and you can see that there by the little lock icon. Now I go back here to the domain controllers, OU, you can see now that this Windows firewall policy is now applied to that OU. And kind of the same thing here with enforce. Use it sparingly. It can really make things more complicated than they really need to be. And what else? Oh, the modeling wizard and the results wizard. Very good tools to use prior to linking your GPOs, so that you know exactly what you're doing in the policy is going to provide the correct condition you're looking for. So that's pretty much the way I do it. You can do some Googling. There is no right answer to how you manage group policy. It's really what's best for you and your particular environment. And really the only PowerShell, there are some PowerShell commandlets in the GPO module, but really the only one I ever use is this GPO report. And that just gets a report of all your GPOs. And that's what this is here. So it's basically showing me all these GPOs, and it's going to give you some detailed information, who owned it, when it was created, when it was modified, where it's linked, what the scope is. So this one's authenticated users, which is the default. And that's it. Just a quick, easy way to get an idea of what policy is. Alright, this is kind of a long, rambling, kind of a change from what I usually do, quick and to the point scripting, but I had this question a couple times, so I figured I would throw a video out there for it. I'm going to leave some links in the description below of some other GPO stuff, more PowerShell stuff, that if you feel like you want to delve into that, go ahead. Like I said, I don't use a whole lot of PowerShell when I'm managing group policy. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.